Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because, well, we're going to completely shatter the traditional, oversimplified myth of early America. You know the story, right? A few pilgrims, a Thanksgiving feast, and then a straight, tidy little line leading right up to the American Revolution. Well, actually, scratch that. The reality drawn from the historical record is vastly more complex, incredibly diverse, and honestly, just absolutely fascinating.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Did the United States really start with just 13 cohesive colonies? We are so used to that monolithic origin story, but North America was actually a massive, messy patchwork of different empires, cultures, and competing interests long before those famous 13 colonies ever decided to unite.
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. Beyond the 13 colonies. 2. The English patchwork. 3. The human cost. 4. Everyday colonial life. And finally, 5. The road to revolution.
All right, let's get into part 1, Beyond the 13 Colonies, the global scramble for North America.
It is absolutely crucial to understand that North America was this massive global chessboard. Spain, France, and the Netherlands were aggressively contesting this territory way before the English ever became the dominant power. Look at this timeline. Other global empires had a massive chronological head start here. Long before the English Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth in 1620, the Spanish attempted a settlement in present-day South Carolina in 1526, and they founded St. Augustine by 1565. Oh, and the Dutch? They had already established New Netherland in 1614.
And these rival empires had completely different blueprints for colonization. Spain's strategy down in the south focused heavily on extracting wealth. We're talking finding precious metals, demanding tribute from dense indigenous populations, and building religious missions. France, on the other hand, stretched across the north and down the Mississippi. Their focus was almost entirely on building vast, lucrative fur trade networks with native peoples, rather than setting up massive, heavily populated settlements.
Moving on to part 2, the English patchwork, regional contrasts. So when we finally zoom in on the English colonies on the eastern seaboard, we really have to realize they were not a monolith, not at all. They were a fractured, culturally distinct set of regional puzzle pieces that actually had very little in common with one another. As you can see, they were divided into 3 starkly distinct worlds. You had the pious, town-based New Englanders relying on maritime trade and subsistence farming. Then you have the middle colonies, kind of the breadbasket, exporting wheat with a highly diverse middle-class society. And down in the south, an entirely different reality. That was an economy heavily dependent on cash crops like tobacco, ruled by a very small, very wealthy Anglican planter elite.
Let's look a bit closer at New England. This was a society actively trying to be a city upon a hill. A strict model of Puritan righteousness. They lived in these tight-knit, egalitarian town communities where local meetings handled pretty much everything. And thanks to a healthier climate and self-supporting farmsteads, they had a surprisingly high life expectancy and built a really robust maritime and shipbuilding economy. Now contrast that directly with the southern colonies. The South's economy was completely driven by soil-exhausting cash crops. First it was tobacco, then rice and indigo. To make this profitable, the region required massive amounts of land and, tragically, a massive labor force. This created a heavily stratified society. It was dominated by a tiny, wealthy, aristocratic class of planters who owned these vast plantations, which left the vast majority of whites as poor subsistence farmers.
This brings us to part 3, the human cost, the bedrock of expansion.
583,000. That is the historical estimate for the total number of enslaved Africans transported directly to the American colonies and eventually the U.S. We simply cannot go through this explainer without looking directly at the sobering realities that enabled all of this incredible colonial growth. The wealth and expansion of these colonies were built squarely on 2 tragic foundations: the systemic displacement of indigenous peoples and the cruel machinery of the Atlantic slave trade. The colonial economy, particularly in the South, but definitely extending through the northern seaports that built the ships and traded the goods, became utterly and entirely dependent on this forced labor. No, the historical record actively pushes back against the myth of passive enslavement. There was a continuous, continent-wide history of violent resistance. Look at this list. From the very first Spanish settlement attempt in 1526 at San Miguel de Gualdape, all the way through the Gloucester County Revolt in Virginia, the Stonewall Rebellion in South Carolina, and the New York insurrections, enslaved people continually organized and fought for their freedom.
At the exact same time, the indigenous populations of North America suffered devastating declines. While European diseases were a massive, massive factor, historical sources point to other deliberate colonial mechanisms of dispossession. Colonists weaponized European concepts of private property. They integrated native groups into trade, allowed them to accrue massive debt, and then used colonial foreclosure laws to legally seize huge tracts of indigenous land.
Part 4. Everyday Colonial Life, Brewing and Identity.
Despite the fractured regions and the brutal realities of expansion we just talked about, quietly, in the background, a uniquely American culture was beginning to brew. I absolutely love this quote from the Pennsylvania Journal in 1756. It says, "The people of this province are generally of the middling sort, and the meanest among them thinks he has a right to civility from the greatest." This perfectly captures that emerging American Republican culture. Unlike Europe, where aristocratic lords held literally all the power, the colonies had wide property ownership, which meant widespread voting rights. It fostered a society where everyday tradesmen and farmers felt they were on a level playing field with the elite.
Let's move to and see how this builds into the colonial demographics. This emerging egalitarian mindset was really reflected in the population. The colonies were becoming a true ethnic melting pot for the era. While about 85% were from the British Isles, you had significant German populations in the Mid-Atlantic and resilient Dutch communities up in New York. All of these groups were retaining their cultural traditions while simultaneously blending into this new, shared, middle-class colonial identity.
Finally, Part 5. The Road to Revolution, Forging a Nation.
Which brings us to the climax of our explainer. How in the world did these vastly different, fiercely independent, and fractured regional puzzle pieces suddenly decide to unite and call themselves Americans? Well, the crucial turning point is the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. This conflict forced men from totally different colonies to travel, intermingle, and fight alongside one another for the very first time. It forged a real military unity. But importantly, by removing the French threat from the continent, the colonists suddenly no longer needed British protection. And because Britain racked up massive debt fighting that war, they decided the colonists should foot the bill.
The result of that decision? A rapid, escalating avalanche of British taxation and punishment. The Stamp Act in 1765 sparked the first continent-wide protests. Then came the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, which of course triggered the famous Boston Tea Party, and finally the Intolerable Acts in 1774, which literally stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance. The British intended to isolate Massachusetts, but instead, it forced all the colonies to realize they were in the exact same boat.
That shared resistance to taxation without representation is what finally transformed our patchwork colonies into a unified front. For the first time, they organized the Continental Congress. Across all 13 colonies, they began ignoring royal governors, setting up their own independent local governments, and actively drilling local militias in preparation for an inevitable war.
The final leap, though, came via the Enlightenment. In 1776, a pamphlet called Common Sense by Thomas Paine swept through the colonies like wildfire. It took all these complex, brewing frustrations and distilled them into a clear, impassioned argument for total independence. It was essentially the philosophical glue that finally bound the pious New Englanders, the diverse Mid-Atlantic merchants, and the Southern planters into a single, unified revolution.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We've seen today that America wasn't born as a single, unified idea, but as a complex, often brutal, and deeply fragmented patchwork of different cultures, economies, and empires. So my question to you is, how do those vastly different regional origins, the distinct cultures of New England, the Middle Colonies, and the South, still shape the cultural and political divides of the nation today? Think about that. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.